Salutations everyone, welcome to another Overwatch 2 video where today we're going to be talking about tanks because they have some big upcoming changes, and it was actually going to be a topic I was going to cover anyway. I've actually had to do this video a couple of times and now having to redo it once again after the recent developer notes. So, the tank role, always been one that's been a touchy, polarizing subject is the tank role because you're a really important character, the most important role in the game, and you're expected to do so much. When you pick tank, you have a long list of responsibilities, things that you are expected to do, right? You are expected to initiate fights, be the one on the objective, holding the objective, fighting the enemy tank. You're also supposed to peel for all of your squishies. You're supposed to defend the position, hold a corner or a defensive stronghold that you've built up, a choke, a doorway, something like that. You're also supposed to be the one to initiate attacks on the offensive side of things. You're supposed to be doing the most damage out of any of the other characters on your team, not more than both DPS put together, usually, although that does sometimes happen. But you're supposed to be able to do the most damage, and you're supposed to tank for your team. You're supposed to have abilities to block or reduce incoming damage for yourself and ideally for the team as well. And there are many different ways that tanks can do all these things. But what tank is good at all of these, you may ask? The answer is none of them. There is no tank that is good at doing all of these things. So when you pick a tank, you are picking what you want to be good at, because no one's going to be good at everything, and every tank is going to have multiple weaknesses that can either be exploited by the enemy team, shored up by your teammates, and your strengths can be, complemented by your team or nullified by what the enemy is doing. And there have been lots of changes to tanks. Obviously, the patch from a couple months ago that changed everything with all the health pools and the damage and projectile sizes of everything. That changed things quite a bit. And the big one, of course, was the damage passive, which was 20% anti-heal, then was nerfed to 15, and now we learned it's going back up to 20. And this is going to have a huge effect on tanks, especially those that do not have damage mitigating abilities and that can be burned down quickly. And this fear is being addressed in today's developer notes, which was talking about big sweeping changes to the tank role. And we have to wonder, is this going to be good enough to fix tank? Because there's a lot of problems. So they are reducing headshot damage by 25%. They are increasing knockback resistance from 30% to 50%. They are reverting the armor damage reduction back to reducing 5 damage per projectile up to a 50% maximum, which I believe is what it was in Overwatch 1's second or third patch when it came to changing the armor. So we're going back to then. Health regen passive is no longer going to be 20 HP per second for all characters. It's going to be 10 health per second plus 5% of their maximum HP per second. So obviously, the characters with the most HP will benefit more from this passive than characters with smaller HP. Obviously, they're squishies. So they use Reinhardt as an example. He will regain 45 health per second, which is more than double what it used to be. Now, there are obviously tanks that are going to trigger this passive more often and consistently than others. Reinhardt, of course, being probably the biggest benefactor because he's got the biggest shield. So the ability to trigger this passive is going to be a lot easier when the tank isn't taking damage. And the easy way for a tank to not take damage is have a big old shield, and that's what Reinhardt has going for him. So those are the changes that they have announced are going to be coming forward, as well as a small buff, maybe quality of life thing to Junker Queen, and quite a few smallish to medium-sized buffs to Wrecking Ball. And we obviously saw him get some changes to the grapple and the adaptive shield in the last patch, and people are still learning to, use that to their advantage. So it is nice to see some changes, some attempts to help out the tank role, especially with the damage passive getting rebuffed. And it makes me think, is this enough to fix tank, or what else can we do? And I'm going to throw out the 6v6 argument right out the window. If you're saying they need to switch back to 6v6, they totally can, they probably will, and they should, click off the video, save yourself some time, because that's not going to happen. First and foremost, it's not going to happen. It's also, it just wouldn't work. People always have rose-colored glasses when it comes to looking how things used to be. People are saying Spider-Man 3 was a fucking masterpiece now, which is crazy. And people are saying, oh, 6v6, 2 tanks, that's when it was good, because that was in the past, and I don't really remember how it was, so I'm going to pretend that it was great. And I admit, I also had my suspicions that 5v5 solo tank was going to be a problem, because you would only have one tank, therefore there would probably a de facto best tank, and it would be difficult to balance. And yes, it is difficult to balance, but also the queue times were just huge, having to rely on people picking tank, because tank is the most important role and the most needed role to be good, but also that contributes to it being the least popular role, and that both of those have always been the case and always will be. Tank will never not be the least important role, and tank will never not be the least popular role. That is just what it's always going to be. And when we did have 6v6, people, when they did pick tank, they would pick Roadhog, right? They would pick a glorified DPS. They didn't want to pick a tank, and nobody wanted to pick a main tank. So if you wanted to win, and you're like, oh, we have 2 tanks. Well, maybe not really, because probably at least one of them is an actual DPS, and you only had 2 to 3 main tanks to choose from. People don't tend to really look at the big picture of what tanks are pickable, what strategies are really feasible and possible in today's day and age, or any day and age, because the majority of us are solo queue players that just don't have comms in their games, right? Nobody's talking, and typically nobody's even pinging or listening to and following pings and things like that. And if you don't want to chat, that's totally fine. That's up to you. There are many reasons to not do so. But to not ping or follow up on pings is a different matter altogether. Anybody can do that. That doesn't take anything out of you to do so. It should be something that everybody does, but almost nobody does do it, and that's a shame. But if you're playing, 5-stack games and you're coordinating and communicating and having fun, that's great. I'm jelly, bang on, mate. Have a great time. But most of us are not in that realm. So there are a lot of choices that we just don't have, right? We have a decent amount of tanks right now. Reinhardt, D.va, Malga, Sigma, Winston, Doomfist, Roadhog, Ramattra, Orisa, Junker Queen, Wrecking Ball, Zarya. But, obviously, map dependent, many of those picks, and comp dependent, many of those picks, so we don't really usually have all these picks to begin with. We can't just pick any tank that we want and have the kind of freedom that DPS or supports really have. And typically when I'm not playing tank, I like to, if I can, wait for my tank to pick their character and then pick something that can complement them, because that's just the best way to benefit the team. But sometimes, the tank takes forever to pick, and you just kind of like, oh, well, this character's usually good here, so I'm going to at least start off. But there's a lot of choices that we just don't really get to have. We don't get to play Winston below, masters are usually grandmasters, right? Winston is just really hard to play and can get consistent value out of without having a really good Winston and really good complementary pieces. Even if you pick, a tank that is more niche on a map that they are good on, you have to have the rest of your team to complement and buy into that strategy. If you're playing Winston, you got to play dive. You can't have, a slow, stationary squishies for the rest of your team and expect that to work a lot of the time. So Winston's just never going to be good at lower ELOs, never really has been, never will be. Yes, you can win with him, and it's freaking awesome when you can get it to work. But it's just typically not a feasible thing. So that's, one, and you have, it's not that he typically has like terrible tank matchups that a lot of them stop him, but Malga deletes him from the game, and multiple DPS can just delete him from the game. Bastion deletes him from the game. Reaper deletes him from the game. It's just the easiest tank to counter from multiple roles, right? So like that's a character we don't really get to pick. Wrecking Ball is not really a character we get. You have to have people to buy in, right? You can't have a super flankable backline that can't defend themselves or have someone to peel for them, because Wrecking Ball has to go in and out on the fight. He can't just like stay on a point and hold it. So you have to have people to buy into that for that to work. So like that's another choice you can't really work for you. Junker Queen is a niche pick, isn't going to work in a lot of circumstances, even if it's a map that works really good for her. D.va, she has more exploitable weaknesses than, say, your Sigmas, your Reinhardts, your Orisas, your Amatras, so she's not going to be as pickable. So like right away, the choices that we have are more limited than they appear at face value. Doomfist is probably going to need some help, and things can really suck when you're playing and you're not tank and you have 5-6 games in a row where it's like, why is my tank going 4-12? Why is my tank going 14-16? Those aren't winning lines. You're not going to win with those kinds of tank lines on your team, those stat lines. You're just not going to win when they're performing that way, and you're getting so many games in a row where it's like, how do I keep getting matchmaking with these terrible tanks, right? We've all had that situation happen to us numerous times, 4 or 6 games in a row where we just keep getting Doomfists that are diving in by themselves and dying before we can even get to help them, or a Roadhog that's just getting blasted by damage. And it can be frustrating. But like, how am I getting matchmaked with these tanks? I don't play that bad when I'm tank, and I'm also the same rank as I am in this game, or what have you. You can understand sometimes when a certain DPS or support are getting shut down and they have a bad game because they're getting particularly focused by Sombra or Tracer, or they're actually successfully diving at the backline or something like that. But when a tank's doing really, really poorly, it can be very, very frustrating because you can't understand how can they be this bad. And sometimes, yes, you just have a bad tank player. They're picking Doomfist and they're just not switching, and they just keep on dying. They're playing Roadhog, but they keep getting antied, and no one's switching to Kiriko to help them because maybe no one knows how to play Kiriko. I don't know. But Orisa. It's like, clearly it's just a bad matchup. You're playing D.va and they're playing Zarya, and their lasers just blasting right through you. You can't defense matrix that, and you're not making the changes that you need to in order to make that comp work. That can be super duper frustrating, and sometimes it's, your tank is really bad. But the tank does get more blame than is typically deserved. Most of the time you're going to see in the chat, right? Tank diff, more so than support diff or DPS diff. Whereas, DPS, it's easier. They have more power now with the damage passive of applying anti-heal, and that, again, is getting buffed. Nobody ever looks at supports because everyone's looking at the big, chonky tank, and they want to do damage to them, and they also want to take out the vulnerable supports on the team. And if you take out supports, they don't have heals. They don't have heals, they lose the game. And often, the damage characters are just left by themselves to do whatever they want. The soldier on the high ground with the mercy pocket, nobody's paying attention. The Sombra that's spawn killing anybody, nobody pays attention. The Bastion in their big old turret form, nobody's paying attention to them. No one's looking at them because they just want to look at the squishies, the supports and the tanks, right? So that's not something that the tank can really control or fix. They can't peel and duel the enemy tank and take care of the objective and kill everything. That's what is expected of them, but a tank cannot do that by themselves. And people talk about, let's eliminate the tank role altogether. Again, we're throwing out the window. If you think that's a possibility or something that can or should happen, you don't know anything about video games. This is clearly your first video game. Congratulations. This is what video games are. And you don't know how companies work. They're not getting rid of tanks. They're not changing into a new role and make them all DPS or like squishy, smaller versions of themselves. People have talked about hero bans, and we already tried hero bans. Granted, they weren't like player created every single match hero bans, but we already tried them. It didn't work. There are already tanks that you can't pick, like I mentioned before, or tanks that you shouldn't pick based off of the meta or what your team comp is or what the map is. And so, like, we already have so many there's just not enough characters for that to work, especially at the tank role where you can only pick one of them. There's so few that you should pick and can pick to make things work. And it also will just make the game harder to balance because the data will be completely thrown off when certain bans and certain win rates, everything is super duper skewed. And people keep talking about how this is a counter pick meta, and like one tank will come out against the other tank, and then you fight, and then you like, all right, if I'm a bad matchup, I got to switch to my tank, and then they switch and they switch. And that might not be ideal for you, but also the DPS and the supports also have to be switching to counteract their Torbjorn, their Bastion, their Sombra, right? Not a lot of people want to take a look at things from a more macro perspective and just say, tank diff. Might as well not even try. Let's throw the game because we have tank diff. Where, yeah, maybe that Doomfist is doing really bad, but maybe they got here playing Doomfist, and that's why they are here, and they're trying to make it work. And if it doesn't work, yes, they should switch. But also, clearly, they're at this level, so it's worked before, probably, and maybe you don't want to switch off of your character, but the end of the day, you want to win, because I'm strictly talking about 5v5 competitive here because that's what I play, so that's what I'm going to talk about. We want to win. That is the goal, and some people don't have that goal in mind when they play comp, and that is, again, a macro issue. But is this really a tank issue, or is this a team issue? Sometimes it can be a tank issue. It's like, man, my tank is throwing. You know, they're just not doing well. They're clearly getting hard countered, and they are not making gameplay changes or character changes to fix that. But also, you're playing a Dorado on attack. They have Soldier and Ashe on the high ground with the Mercy pocket. Not a lot of tanks can deal with that, and not a lot of tanks can get to that high ground without getting blown up, and those that can't do it by themselves. There isn't a tank that exists that can do that right now, so they're going to need help, and then maybe the DPS or the support need to switch, or at the very least they have to be on the same page and help. And having Roadhog and Mauga in this game does not help. Those are like tanks that are either way too strong or just not pickable. Right, and the damage passive has fluctuated on which of those pots those characters belong in at any present moment. They're just not very well designed tanks because they do not help the team. And Roadhog is more in this camp than Mauga, because Mauga is just pure DPS. Roadhog is just pure DPS, and yeah, sure, it can work, and at the highest echelons of play, you see Roadhog and Mauga have really high win percentages, but when you get below Masters, you do not see that. And Winston is also, of course, not an applicable character at most levels, so our choices are already slim. Hero bans will not work. It make the balance harder. Changing to 66 doesn't work. Will these new tank changes help? With the damage passive getting buffed, it makes sense that they would want to make changes because they nerfed that in the first place for a reason. And tanks either die too quickly or never die at all. That is what they said in the dev notes today. And those are the typical complaints that people have. Is there a way to fix it? I don't think that there is. At least there hasn't been one that has been suggested thus far in history that I think can work. Hopefully this is a good step on the right path, but maybe there's the DPS passive needs to be looked at again. Maybe certain characters need to get more reworks. I don't know. There's no way to make every tank just as good as one another. There are some that will always be niche. There were some that will always be all-arounders, and there were some tanks like Orisa that people will only allow to be good for a couple of weeks at a time.